Welcome to another sold out night at the Velvet Night! The Velvet Note's a place where you can see and hear world-class musicians in a setting that's as intimate and as comfortable as your living room. We give you a chance to get to know the musicians here and to hear the music the way that it was meant to be heard. We're a listening room. We had our acoustics designed by a protege of the Hollywood director George Lucas, under his guidance, to be the highest quality, unenhanced sound available today. And after 9 years and 5 months, we're proud to let you know that we've received 6 consecutive awards from Downbeat Magazine for being one of the top 100 jazz clubs in the world. We love doing this on Sunday nights. And by this, I mean that this is another Legends of Jazz series session in which we get kind of a combination between a jazz history or jazz appreciation class and a concert. And tonight, the concert is centered around a mystery that has always plagued me. Who is Pannonica? Yes. I know, right? So we're gonna find out tonight about Baroness Pannonica Rothschild and what she had to do with jazz. It's a mystery, but it won't be when we're out of here. I wish I could join you. I'll be in the kitchen, cooking your dinner.
So far, so good.
Really? Thank you, sir. And what does your bride have to say? She's very quiet next door. She's saying thing? Okay, I gotcha. On our stage tonight, we have actually our house pianist, and he doesn't get seen in this show very often, but we have him tonight, Randy Hexter. On saxophone, John Sanford. Grammy Award winner, Kevin Smith on bass. And herding the cats, we've got the MC extraordinaire, the researcher, the band leader, and one of my favorite people when he acts right. Drummer Justin Vaughn. Tonight, for dessert, we have key lime pie, apple pie, pecan pie, and blueberry pie. And last night, I told a joke that involved the number 3.14, and only the guy who was sitting here got it.
Well, tell him again.
Put your hands together for the Justin Vaughn Quartet!
Thank you all so much. That tune was entitled Nika's Tempo, written by the great alto saxophonist by the name of Gigi Grice, and that was recorded by, among many people, the version we were kind of paying tribute to was Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. There's a couple of main misconceptions about the person we're going to speak about tonight. One is her name. It's often pronounced as Pannonica, but it's actually Pannonica, I learned from her niece. So it's Pannonica all these years. Also, she says that she was named after a butterfly because her father, Charles Rothschild, was an entomologist, and which is kind of true, but she's really named after a moth, and that just really doesn't really have the same punch as saying you're named a butterfly, since they're basically cousins. So everybody says she's named after a butterfly, but it's really just a little moth. But long story short, this lady's journey and her impact on jazz is pretty heavy, and we're gonna get into that tonight. All the songs we're doing tonight are songs that jazz musicians dedicated to her because of all the work that she did for them, particularly in the 50s and 60s. She was born into the esteemed Rothschild family. She was born Pannonica Rothschild. The history of the Rothschilds, they come from a really small ghetto in Frankfurt, where basically they put, if you were Jewish, you had to live in this really tight, cramped place, and it's really kind of a poverty-stricken area. And through that, the patriarch of the family started a little coin business, and slowly but surely it grew into an entire financial empire. One of the things that the patriarch of the family did was lay the groundwork so that you had to be not only a Rothschild to run the family business, but you also had to be male to run the family business. So they built this entire empire, and they had all of these international banks, all across Europe, run by a male Rothschild. And then, as you might imagine, this is just how kind of nature and life works. All of a sudden, all of these male Rothschilds kept having girls. 14 straight at one point. I'm not making that up. 14 straight. And to the point that they literally had to close 2 branches. I don't know, maybe give a girl a job, but that's a whole other discussion. So if you were a female Rothschild, your job was to stay home, and you were raised by your nannies, you were raised by your maids. You had somebody do everything for you, and basically your job was just to kind of host parties and all that. All the male Rothschilds were doing all of these things, and your job was just to stay there. So, as you might imagine, over the course of the generations, eventually there came a generation where they all kind of looked around and said, "Nah, we're not going to do this anymore." So that was Pannonica's generation. She's from Charles Rothschild, and Charles Rothschild had 4 children, and one was a boy. They got one boy named Victor. The other three were girls, and that generation of the Rothschilds decided it was time to kind of break rank here. And it really started with their father, Charles. Their father, Charles, didn't go into the banking industry. Instead, he was a scientist, and he, in particular, had a love of animals and discovering species, and kind of broke that Rothschild chain, if you will. And from that, obviously that's where Pannonica got her name from. These Rothschilds decided to kind of break away, and they still wanted to find a passion and do something important. The female Rothschilds really got into philanthropy, helping others and trying to connect other people and use their fortune to help others. And Pannonica was no different in this. But growing up in that kind of environment was not a good fit for her. She was not somebody that enjoyed schedules or being told what to do. She just kind of wanted to do her own thing. And so apparently she was hard to marry off, which I kind of take as a compliment. I mean, at this point. So because basically everybody, well, cool, we're going to do this if we get married. She's like, no, I'm just going to do what I was going to do anyway. It took her a while, but eventually she was able to find a man, a baron by the name of Jules, when they got married, it was Jules der Königsvater, so Pannonica Rothschild became Pannonica die Königsvater. And he was a baron, a rich man, and he brought, they at first had a great relationship, but the more they worked together as a team, the more the whole scheduling thing was yet again an issue for Pannonica. She often referred to her childhood and then her first marriage as being in a gilded cage. Seems like it's great, but you have basically zero freedom. But her brother, Victor, was really big into jazz. And Victor got her listening to jazz records to the point that Victor was so into jazz that the great pianist for years with Benny Goodman and lots of others, Teddy Wilson, when Teddy Wilson would travel to Europe, Victor would take piano lessons with Teddy, and Teddy would give him all of these records, and that kind of got Pannonica listening to this great music. And so right before she married Jules, she decided to take a little girls' trip and went over to New York City for the first time to go hear her first live jazz in New York City. And this really starts to set her path off from everyone else. So we're gonna give you a little demonstration of something she might have heard then. This is a tune written, shockingly for her, by the great pianist Kenny Drew. This is entitled Blues for Nika. we came out here, we were talking about this particular tune, Blues for Nika, and we decided, as an ensemble, everybody agreed, everybody was on board, yes, unanimous, that we were going to start this song, and Kevin was going to play basically half as many notes, and I was going to play the groove on the hi-hat, and just like a whole little cool jazzy thing you could do at the beginning of a song to kind of like ease into it. And I counted off the tune, and I was like, right over here where I wasn't supposed to be, and Kevin was playing all the quarter notes he wasn't supposed to be. We just looked at each other like, why did we even talk about that? And poor Randy's over there shaking his head like, we talked about this? I swear, I distinctly remember.
I just said it.
So, Blues for Nika. So I thought that Nika, short for Pannonica, obviously, was the jazz musician's nickname that they gave her. I was wrong. Apparently, that's what her family called her, even when she was a little girl. So, Nika, as she was known to all, went to New York right before she got married, got to hear live jazz, also just got to experience everything that New York has to offer in terms of bustling thoroughfares. Now, this is someone who's been to Paris and all these other wonderful places, but there was something about America and New York City and being, free to do whatever she wants to do. That really, resonated with her. She hadn't really had that experience, truly had that experience until she went to New York. When she got back home and got married, as I'd mentioned, her husband Jules was really had everything. He's the type of person, it's like there are two kinds of people. When you go on vacation, there's two kinds of people. One person wants to schedule everything down to the minute, and the other person just wants to hang out. And those two people get married. That's what happens. So that was the case here, and it got to the point where this will be our last show at the Velvet Note. So it got to the point where it caused a serious strain in their relationship. As she put it, he would get angry. He would break her jazz records when she was late for dinner, and in her words, she was always late for dinner. She was just one of those kinds of, she just ran on her own schedule. So, but as that turmoil kind of built up, and she found herself in basically her second gilded cage, all that kind of got put on hold, because at this time, this is right around the time, this is a few years before World War II. And if you are a member of the Rothschild family, you are a member of the most powerful and most prestigious and easily recognizable Jewish family in Europe. So when anti-Semitism starts to build and things are building, Hitler actually mentions the Rothschilds a couple of times in some of his speeches. So things take a much different turn for Nika and her family. And the fact that the Rothschilds did not have very many male heirs, and they were sticking to this only male thing, they no longer had the political influence that they once had. So this was terrible timing for lots of reasons. So her husband Jules decided to enlist into the Free French Army to fight in the war, and Nika decided to do the same thing. So she had her kids shipped off to family members that were far away where the kids would be safe, and she also elected to join the French Army. Yet again, we have a difference here where the men go out and fight and go all over the world and try to save the world, and the women in the French Army are supposed to stay in France and do secretary things and things like that. So her husband got shipped out to North Africa to fight. She had to stay in France, and she pleaded with the general of the base and said, "Please let me go be with my husband, at least fight the war with my husband." He was told in no uncertain terms, there's no way that's going to happen. So she literally just left the army base as if she didn't have any responsibility to be there. She left the army base and this should go without saying, but there's clearly like no cell phone. She just leaves, and no one has any idea where she is. It takes her about 3 or 4 weeks. She somehow gets herself in the middle of a war from France all the way to Africa. The only documentation they have is that she got sick once and ended up in a hospital somewhere along the way, so they can say, okay, well, there she is. This is obviously well after the fact. She also got into a bad car accident and was hospitalized for a while. We'll get into the car accident thing in a little bit. But somehow, one day, she just wanders onto her husband's base. I mean, you can't even, I literally can't find Publix without Waze telling me how to get there. And this lady got all the way, in the middle of a war, by the way, all the way down to Africa, just waltzed in like, hey, honey, here I am. So they didn't know what to do with her because she's not supposed to be there, and so they let her fight in the war. So she became a decoder, and she also, because her husband Jules knew how to fly planes, she also taught herself how to fly planes. So she flew planes during the war, to the point that by the end of the war, she went from being AWOL, and essentially they basically kicked her out, but she just showed up to the base and started fighting. So they're like, all right, I guess you're still here. Anyway, she eventually earned lieutenant by the end of the war. So the war ends, and Jules and Nika move to Mexico, where Jules is an ambassador over there. And while she's in Mexico, she hears Duke Ellington's long-form composition, Black, Brown, and Beige. And she credits this album, this music, what she called a jazz symphony, which I think is kind of curious because, you know, Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn, and they would write all these beautiful 45-minute long pieces, but they never were called symphonies. They had to be somehow segregated from classical music, so they were called, you know, extended works and suites and all these other names, but she just called it a jazz symphony because that's exactly what it was. Then she went up to New York. This is in 1948. She goes up to New York, and she's there visiting, going to hear Coleman Hawkins and some other great musicians. She's got a flight back to Mexico. On the way to the flight, she stops and sees her old pal, Teddy Wilson. They're hanging out, they're listening to records. And all of a sudden, Teddy goes, man, have you heard this new record? And he puts it on, and Nika becomes transfixed. She's never heard music like this. And it literally transformed her. It all of a sudden gave her purpose in life. And if you remember, she comes from a family where everyone in the family, particularly if you're male, are handed purposes. You're going to go be a banker. You're going to be a scientist. You're going to be all this. And she hadn't found that for herself. Her generation and her father broke the mold that you had to become a banker as a Rothschild, but she still hadn't found her passion. And this one song was so impactful. She said she stayed at Teddy's apartment and she played the record at least 20 times, and she missed her flight. And she literally never went back to Mexico. She stayed in New York from that point on, and her job, in her mind, was to find this man and help this man any way that she could. The man is Thelonious Monk, and the composition is Round Midnight. So we're going to play for you now our own version of Monk's version of Round Midnight that was recorded in 1948. No pressure, John. This
Right.
has changed
Yeah.
the course of I mean, I don't think any baroness is going to try and follow you around the world after that, John, but great job. Mr. John Sanford on the tenor saxophone. That was your one chance. So 1948, she decides to stay in New York and find this Thelonious Monk. What she doesn't know is that Thelonious Monk recently had his cabaret card revoked. And for those of you who aren't familiar with how that works, you have to be a real jazz dork to know what that is. So we all know. But basically, if you wanted to work in New York City, you had to have this card. It was like a license, basically, to go into any sort of venue, a club or a theater, or even play a wedding, that sort of thing. You had to have this card, and if you got arrested or something happened, they could revoke it. And Monk had his revoked, and he had it revoked for 7 years. And this is pivotal here because the recording that Pannonica heard around midnight was one of the very first recordings that Monk made. At this time, most people didn't understand Monk's playing, musicians and critics. There's lots of pretty terrible critical reviews written about him during this time. He was one of the fathers of bebop music, which was developed in the early and mid 40s. But when the music started to come out, and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis, all of these big names, all of these names started to get all the credit for bebop, as well they should. Monk was left in the dark for two reasons. One, his style of piano playing was very different than any other piano player, and people just weren't ready for it at that point. And two, he couldn't play anywhere. He couldn't go out and do gigs with Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and all of that. So he was mostly homebound at this point, he and his wife Nellie, where he practiced on an old beat-up upright piano in their apartment. So Nika couldn't find Monk. Nika couldn't go hear Monk play for several years. What she did do in the meantime, she loved two things probably more than jazz. One, really cool fancy cars, and two, fur coats. So everywhere she went in New York City, she would stick out like a sore thumb because she would drive this really big white Rolls Royce and get out of the car and wear this huge fur coat. And the even weirder part of this is that she would get out of this car and then walk downstairs into a jazz club, and I was just like, what just, this is like, what just happened here? And she started to try and listen to as much jazz as she could. She tried to become part philanthropist and try to help these musicians get managers. If they needed rides to gigs, she would be driving down. There's stories of her driving down Broadway in her Rolls Royce with some musicians in the back, and then up pulls next to her this like a bright yellow Mercedes, and she looks over and it's Miles Davis, and he goes, "You want to race?" And they race down the highway. Apparently, this happened a couple of times because she's famous for saying, "This time I'm going to win." There might have been some expletives in there that I'll leave out, but this time I'm going to win. So, but she was meeting Sonny Rollins and a lot of great jazz musicians and helping them as much as she could. But after a while of not hearing Monk or seeing Monk, she started to kind of lose some steam. And then one of her really close friends at this point, great pianist and composer, Miss Mary Lou Williams. These two were thick as thieves. They'd go everywhere together. Mary Lou heard that Monk was actually going to play in Paris. And so as baronesses do, she was like, all right, well, we're going to hop the next flight to Paris. Let's go, right? Like, what do you mean, like now? Like, yeah, let's go right now. So Mary Lou, they grabbed a little bag of stuff. It's probably great to have like a baroness as a best friend, right? Just go all over the world. So they flew over to Paris, and she finally got to meet Monk. The story goes that they hit it off, and got to, she got to really explain to him how much she thought of his music and how she thought he was misunderstood. And then when they came back to New York, Monk and his wife Nellie and Nika all sat down and put a plan together, because Monk was a genius on the piano, but socially he had areas where he'd become challenging. So there was kind of two parts of this. So Nellie handled one part and Nika handled the other part, and they got Monk moving in the right direction. They got him a couple of gigs, and eventually he got his cabaret card back. It took a while for him to get that cabaret card back. Until then, she had this suite in the Stanhope Hotel, and every night she would invite all the jazz musicians, Sonny Rollins and Miles Davis and Charlie Parker and you name it, all up to her suite, where she bought a Steinway 9-foot grand piano and put it in the room and basically turned it into a nightly jam session. The other thing about this is that, so she would invite all of these great jazz musicians up. This is, this is in the late 1940s, and the Stanhope was a segregated hotel. So black people don't just walk through the door. They have to go up through the freight elevator. Unless you're a baroness, in which case you say, no, they're just going to walk through the front door like every other person and try and stop me. To the point that the Stanhope tried to kick her out by saying, we've tripled your rent. And she goes, okay, go. Yeah, no, I'm still staying, and they're still going to walk through the front door. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it, because I'm basically keeping you guys alive. So they would go up to her room, and that's where they would get a chance to play and work with Monk. Not in the clubs, because he wasn't allowed. She created a club so that all the musicians would go. And the stories are that she said, order anything off of room service. I don't care. Get every steak and lobster you can think of. It's all on me. So all these really hungry musicians after the gig, not that we know anything about that. We have to go to Taco Mac, but the number of times, I want to paint a picture for you real quick. But before you feel bad for her, the number of times it's like, what time is this gig? Like 8:30? The number of times it's like midnight. And we're all sitting around on the couch and, remember that one time? And in the corner is Andrea and Sheila and Tamara going like, oh my God, they won't leave. They won't leave. And I go, I'm so sorry, we're just about out of here. And they go, oh no, it's fine, it's totally fine. I don't have anything else to do, so that's to spare you, Miss Fuller. So, at any rate. In that process, Monk actually did get to connect with all of these great musicians, and she got to meet a lot of wonderful musicians. Eventually, she was able to help Monk secure his first major record contract with Columbia Records. And on that album, that very first album that Monk's going to make, he's going to write a song for Nika and dedicate it to her for helping her get this record contract and just for being a great friend. We're going to play that tune for you right now. This is a beautiful tune by Monk entitled Pannonica. So in the process of trying to help as many jazz musicians as she could and try to help lift up this music, particularly during the bebop era, she had an incredibly unlucky set of circumstances that befell her. She was normally on a weeknight. Pannonica is not home. She's out at a jazz club listening to great music. But this particular night, she decided to stay home at the hotel because she had been hosting her daughter Yanka. Her and her daughter Yanka were really close. She was also raised to be a big jazz fan. Jules and Pannonica, who were still married but separated, spent a lot of time, getting together so that the kids can hang out and all that. There was a lot of back and forth there. Jules was actually up in New York City. He was temporarily there as an ambassador, so Nika was getting a lot of time to spend with her children, including Yanka. So her and Yanka were going to have like a girls' night in, and she got a knock. There was a knock at the door, and it was Charlie Parker. Now Charlie Parker and Nika knew each other, but really only as acquaintances. That he would come to the jam sessions at the Stanhope at that point. So he went to her house because he was feeling really ill. He was supposed to go to a gig in Boston, but he couldn't make the trip. He felt really ill, so he didn't have any other place to turn. So he went to Nika's house, Nika's hotel room, hoping she would be there. She was. Her and her daughter took Bird in. She called her personal doctor to come check out Bird, try to give him some medication and take care of him. They propped him up on his couch. They were watching TV, but it was too little too late, and Charlie Parker passed away, and passed away in the hotel room. One of the things that almost always gets left out was that Nika's daughter, Yanka, was there. Yanka doesn't talk about it, and you won't see it written in many places. Her niece, Hannah Rothschild, was the one who wrote about this and interviewed Yanka and whatever, but because there's lots of rumors going around of what Charlie Parker might have been doing at her hotel room that late at night, but it certainly wasn't what you might think. He was there because he needed help, and he knew that Nika would help her, and sure enough, Nika tried to help her. So he passes away in the apartment, and the press has a field day with this. The New York Times version of TMZ basically started following her around, and anytime she would go to a jazz club after that, they would write about her, hanging out with some other jazz musician. All of this negative press had a couple of major impacts on Nika. For one, this was kind of the last straw in her marriage with Jules. The strain of her putting her daughter in that kind of position kind of sealed the deal for Jules. So they started to get a divorce. Her family, who was already, they weren't thrilled that she was over in America hanging out with all these jazz musicians when she could be a scientist or a banker. They saw what she was doing as a waste of time and a waste of her talent and her money. So they also all but ostracized her at this point. And the Stanhope Hotel, who had been waiting for a reason to finally be able to kick her out, finally had enough ammunition to kick her out of the Stanhope. So she was all of a sudden husbandless and homeless and distraught. And it's at this time really where the jazz musicians she had been helping help her and prop her up and help her spend a lot. She's feeling alone, and they're spending a lot of time with her and trying to keep her spirits up. Because I've read a dozen interviews with famous jazz musicians about her, and there's one clear storyline through their feelings about Nika, and it's that at that time in the mid 1940s, this is a decade or two after jazz, was getting played on the radio and all the kids were dancing to it and all that, right? This is bebop now in New York City, and except for a very small group of people, nobody gave it any respect. And when these musicians got off the bandstand, where they were cheered and whatever, they couldn't go into restaurants and they couldn't go into hotels, and they were doing all this work. And they would say time and time again to a man, every one of them said, to have literal royalty, think that you are royalty because of what you're doing, and treat you like royalty, and make sure you have all the things that you think you deserve that no one else is helping you get, really made an immeasurable impact on some of the great musicians that we now listen to, Charlie Parker and Sonny Rollins, and Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk. When they thought nobody was listening or nobody cared, Nika was one of the few that helped him feel that way. And a lot of great jazz musicians wrote tunes for her in honor. There have been 25 compositions written for Nika. We're going to play all of them tonight. So sit back and rest. And they all have saxophone solos, so smoke them if you got them. We're going to do one for you right now. This is by the pianist Barry Harris. This is kind of like a goofy jazz thing where you take someone's name or a title of something and you mix up the letters, and then it becomes hip to call it that. So this is called Inca, as if it's some surprise how to put those words back together so it spells Nika. I'll leave that up to you. John can't do it. Too many letters. But we're going to play this tune for you now. Barry Harris's Inca. We were supposed to do it last time, and I skipped it. 1, 2. all so much. So, in 1957, finally, Thelonious Monk got his cabaret card reinstated. And as soon as he did, Nika helped him secure a gig at the Five Spot. And back then, if you could get one of these, it was a great kind of gig. It wasn't just that he got to play a weekend there, he had a residency there. Back then in the 50s, jazz musicians could go to a club and play for weeks or maybe months at a time, same gig, same club every single night. And Nika helped secure this gig. At the time, the Five Spot was just a kind of like a little hole-in-the-wall place. It wasn't some prestigious jazz club, but she was able to get him a gig there. One of the first things she did when she booked him the gig was she didn't think the piano was very good. Again, it's kind of like a hole-in-the-wall jazz club, and so she went out and bought the club a new piano that was the kind of piano that would make Monk be able to play the way he plays, because again, he has a unique style of playing. So she bought a piano for the club, knowing that Monk would have a residency there, and she would every night, as you imagine, she would sit there in one of the front rows, and it got to the point where she would announce the beginning of the show from her seat, as if it were an imaginary radio show, a radio show that she called Nika's Tempo, which is how the name of the first tune we played tonight came from. And Monk was there for a long time. She would sit at that club. She also would go to jazz clubs often. She would always bring a Bible and set it on her table. And if you opened up the Bible, there'd be a little flask. She might put a little extra into whatever's going on, then quickly close the Bible, and it's stayed there right on the table. But that residency did numbers, not only obviously for the club itself, which became a famous jazz club because of it, but to give Monk a regular place to develop a band and to develop an audience and really get to finally shine. So this is 1957. This really, all of a sudden, Monk's career started to take off, and by the early to mid '60s, Monk becomes an international jazz figure. Everyone's playing his music. He ends up on the cover of Time magazine. And remember that the record that Nika heard was from 1948. So this took almost 20 years to happen or 40 years, excuse me. No, 20 years for Monk took about 40 years to get to this point, and Nika's involvement took about 20 years. But they finally got Monk well past when a jazz musician should have been in their prime. Monk was finally internationally recognized, making good money for his family and all that sort of stuff. That stuff almost didn't happen because it was October of 1958, and she's booked Monk on a set of gigs in Baltimore. And she and Monk and his saxophonist Charlie Rouse all get in her white Rolls Royce. They head down the turnpike. This is a good time to tell you, Nika was a notoriously terrible driver. I'd already mentioned one of the accidents she got into. And it wasn't because she didn't know how to drive a car. I mean, she could fly a plane, right? It's that all of her European upbringing taught her that if you're having a conversation with somebody, you have got to look them in the eye. Even if they're in the back seat. There's all these stories where, no, it's okay, we'll talk later, just turn around, there's a truck coming. So anyway, so they're going down the turnpike, they're heading, and they get to Delaware, and Monk has to use the restroom. Now, although, we kind of look at, when you look back at racism and how it all worked, and you think about the North and the South, sometimes you can forget that the North was almost equally as racist at this time. So you leaving, unless you were in like New York or Chicago or someplace like that. So when they got into Delaware and they tried to stop and use and Monk to go use the bathroom, every store, you see all these signs that said that that he wasn't going to be allowed, and they finally found a hotel, and Monk just couldn't wait any longer. So Monk runs into the hotel just to use the bathroom. The hotel clerk calls the police. The state troopers come. At first, it looks like everything's going to be fine, But then they decide that they're going to go ahead and arrest not only Monk, but Charlie Rouse. And Charlie Rouse has done nothing but sit in the backseat of a car. But so they start to arrest them, and in the process, they search the car and they find marijuana in the car. And so now they're definitely putting both Monk and Charlie Rouse in prison for this. Remember that Monk just got his cabaret card back. He just got finally playing music in live venues. So Nika panicked, and Nika said, "That's mine. It's not theirs. You have to let them go. That was me. This is my marijuana," and which it wasn't. But she took the rap for them, and she got sentenced to 3 years in prison. And at the end of the prison sentence, she's going to get on a plane and get deported. She's not going to be allowed back in the United States. As you might imagine, things already being tough with her and her family, this would have just ended a lot of things for her. She sacrificed herself so that Monk could keep his cabaret card and keep going. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. They appealed the decision, which took about 2 years. Within those 2 years, the Rothschild family could not believe she would sacrifice herself for this strange pianist. So they would fly, the family started to fly to New York and hang out with Nika and meet these musicians. Like, what are you doing over here? This makes no sense to us. And the longer they were there and the more they interviewed some of these musicians that would go there, it finally clicked to them. A couple of things did. One, that just like her father and her brother and her all of her relatives, she had found her passion, and she had found something that meant something to her and she thought was valuable, and she was going to continue to fight for it at all costs, as if she were a scientist trying to get something published or proven. She was going to sacrifice everything for what she believed in. They understood that, but the other thing they understood, they started to parallel. This is a family that whose past comes from being considered part of a race that nobody liked, and they were put in a ghetto in Frankfurt, and they lived in filth, and they were not allowed to leave that area, and they were being held down by another race who didn't think that they were as equal or worthy. And then World War II happens, and the same thing happens. So this is a family that understands, at least on some level, what it's like to not be allowed the same opportunities as someone else just because of where you come from. That really resonated with the Rothschilds. They finally started to understand what Nika was doing. So they decided to find the best lawyers money could buy. And if you're the Rothschilds, that probably means the best lawyers in the galaxy, I'm gonna guess, just because that's a lot of money. They could buy a lot of things. So they hired a team of lawyers, and they were able to get Nika off on a technicality because they didn't search the car legally. Basically, it was an illegal search. Even though she had already said that she pled guilty to it. So they were able to avoid that, narrowly avoid it. It actually helped bring her and her family together, and they started to really understand, at least on some level, what they were doing. Nika and Monk would go on, their relationship would last 28 years. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship. If you wouldn't, I didn't really know this either until I read, but again, interviews with family and friends, Nika treated Monk and Monk treated Nika more like mother-son. There was nothing physical or intimate there. It was a family thing. Her and Nellie, Monk's wife, were very close. Nellie had a lot of physical things that she was dealing with, and as you might imagine, a genius eccentric is a hard person to also be handling while you're also trying to raise kids and take care of yourself. So Nika, Nellie, and Monk all had a very fruitful relationship for almost 28 years until Monk finally retired from playing, and in which case he would Nika and her and Monk still stayed close until Monk passed away, and then Nika would eventually pass away in 1988. She had a profound impact on jazz in so many ways. Again, treating these musicians like royalty in a time when almost no one else did. I'd mentioned many songs were written about her. We spent a lot of time talking about Monk, but there's another important set of jazz musicians who were almost equally buoyed by her, and that's the Jazz Messengers. She managed them for a while. She would buy them suits and help them turn themselves into a full-fledged band, mainly run by Art Blakey and Horace Silver. And the two of them were very close to Nika, and on their first major album, similar to Monk, they wrote a tune and dedicated it to her. So we're going to close the evening out tonight with that tune. Before we go, please help me thank Mr. John Sanford on the tenor saxophone, Mr. Randy Hexter on the piano, and Kevin Smith on the bass. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to close out with Horace Silver's Nika's Dream. John Sanford, Randy Hexter, Kevin Smith, my name is Justin Barnes. Thank you so much for coming and spending your Sunday evening with us. We really appreciate it. And now here's the owner of the establishment, Miss Tamara Fuller.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We loved having you. We'd love to have you again. You can find all of our upcoming shows at thevelvetnote.com. And I want to give a special thanks to our subscribers. We appreciate the fact that come rain, come shine, come hot weather or cold, come Hawks, come Falcons, come Braves. You're still with us. Thank you. You have lots of great shows coming up, including 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks from now. We'll have the legendary drummer Jeff Tain Watts here for a 2-night run. And I strongly recommend that you get a chance to see him while you can. He's phenomenal. This is what we love to do, which is to bring you closer to artists who inspire you, closer to each other, and closer to the song that's in your heart. Come back and see us again soon. Good night.